Mirror TV. The world is thinking.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Philip Cunliffe. I'm from King's College London. I'm going to be chairing the session, which is Eco-imperialism. I'm involved with I'm the co-convener of the Sovereignty and its Discontents group, which is one of the partner organizations sponsoring this session. So we're often told, the theme of this session is often we're told about kind of that we need global solutions to global problems. And this is always asserted. But of course, whenever these issues become involved with relations between states, it immediately becomes political. It immediately becomes an issue of how you manage political relations between states in trying to coordinate these global solutions to environmental problems that are called for. And the other kind of issue that comes through with that, which is often overlooked, I think, in discussions of international environmental politics, is the issues that are always involved in politics itself, which is to say issues of domination, issues of power, issues of ideology, issues of inequality. And how do these factors play out in the international politics of the environment? And is there indeed a new strain of domination emerging around the politics of the environment that we can call eco-imperialism? Is the scale and scope of the ecological crisis so grave and so demanding that the traditional political ideas that we hold to, like democracy, accountability, legitimacy, they have to be put to one side in order to speedily resolve the impending ecological catastrophe? Those are some of the things I want to grapple with in this debate. So I'll introduce the speakers. We'll go with, we're missing the fourth speaker, who's Daniele Archibugi, but we'll go in the order in which they're sitting from left to right. So first to start is Andrew Holden, who is Professor of the Environment and Tourism at the University of Bedfordshire and the author of Environment and Tourism. Then it is Ross Clark, who's author of The Grade Before, contributor to The Times and Spectator. And then over here is Kirk Leech, who's a researcher in development at King's College London and works for the Research Defence Society. So without further ado, the speakers are going to speak very briefly for 15 minutes. I'm going to keep them to time, so we have as much time as possible to involve the audience. And after that, I'll have a bit of a banter on the panel between the speakers, and then I'll bring you guys in. So, Andrew.
Well, good afternoon. I'd like to begin by just say thank you for the invitation to talk here this afternoon. My talk is going to introduce a lot of points around the idea of eco-imperialism and probably take about 8 minutes, something like that, so it's not too long, but raises a lot of issues. What I would say about eco-imperialism is that if we had been sat here a century ago, for the British people in this audience, our connotations of empire and imperialism would probably have been substantially different to those that we hold today. Imperialism would largely have been held as something that was positive, a product of philosophy and policy, rather than today's derided paradigm representing exploitation, racism, military brutalism, and a denial of human rights, aptly symbolized in contemporary science fiction by the evil empire of the Star Wars genre. Thus, I would argue that the passage of time, accompanied by changing ethical and moral paradigms, leads to differing evaluations of empires and imperialism. A very simple example. For example, in the United Kingdom, some people are now fighting to safeguard imperial measures, the evolution of which can be traced to Roman and Norman invasions against the more recent metric ideas and invasions of Brussels. So the shifts in paradigms of the evaluation of imperialism raise pertinent questions to the framework of eco-imperialism. I would suggest that this term, for many people, automatically conjures a negative image, the suffix of imperialism being weightier than the more positive prefix of eco. Think eco, think small, think beautiful, think of a Western adaptation of the Eastern. Western cultural constructs of eco are driven by romanticism, epitomised in Rousseau's Noble Savage, a way of life lost since Industrial Revolution and modernisation. For the world's poor, trying to work out a living for themselves and members of their families, eco may well, of course, have a different significance to that it has in the West, signifying a denial of access to resources and a loss of their livelihood opportunities. We live in a heightened state of global interconnectivity, underwritten by the hegemonic relationship of the developed with the developing, itself a legacy of European imperialism. The subsequent inequalities of levels of development and opportunities influences and limits our global approach to environmental problems and issues. For example, in case of disagreement over how to approach global warming and climate change. However, in the case of the natural environment, for the first time, hegemonic relationships are no longer an issue purely of human actions between peoples, between states, between social classes, and between castes, as is hinted at in the abstract for this session by the term ecocide. Hegemonic relationships now incorporate ethical issues of the rights of nature, the rights of other sentient and non-sentient beings to an independent existence, a progression towards Earth jurisprudence. So there is a complex amalgam of power relationships within environmental problems, which produce challenging questions that don't have easy answers. For example, radical agendas of bottom-up development, power transference away from established elites, equality in decision-making, all have a resonance and appeal to my own political principles. However, I also have strong environmental principles that may conflict with my anthropogenic political principles. For example, if the radical same political process results in a community deciding that the destruction of a local coral reef is the most appropriate way to enhance their livelihood opportunities, I find this more difficult to reconcile and agree with. The pace of environmental problems we now face, global warming, rapid loss of biodiversity and pollution, dictate a need for quick solutions if there is a desire to maintain recognised patterns in the natural system. As we know, these problems cannot be solved by nation states or the Western world in isolation. It requires multinational cooperation and action. If we take the meaning of imperialism at its most general, to refer to any and every type of relation between a more powerful state or society and a less powerful one, my argument is that the concept is not automatically bad. Rather, it is the ethical basis of the imperialism that is determinate to judging it good or bad. Part of this ethical equation includes environmental as well as human ethics. Just as attitudes to human rights have changed over the last century, so have attitudes to environmental welfare. The days of the instrumental use of nature has been replaced by a conservation ethic, which incorporates a mix of ecocentric and anthropocentric interests. For example, the safari tourism to British East Africa of 100 years ago was based on the shooting and killing of wildlife and big game. Today, it is primarily based upon the shooting of photographs and the viewing of wildlife. If imperialism acts on the principle in environmental ethics of the protection of ecosystems or individual species, or on the principle of utilitarianism concerning human interests, does this make it acceptable? For example, an international environmental non-governmental organisation that enters into debt for nature schemes with the aim of establishing protected areas, species conservation and eco-tourism to enhance livelihood opportunities for women. Are they guilty of eco-imperialism or should they be praised? Eco-imperialism does not have to equate with Paul Dryson's disturbing adage of green power, black death. Whilst, of course, eco-imperialism may, in the neoliberal world of Darth Vader, still be based on racism, the cheating and swindling of indigenous people out of assets, military force, and the denial of human rights, it may also be based, We may also be based as an adaptive paradigm for maximising the greater good for local and global society, for the well-being of other individual and collective sentient and non-sentient beings. Over time, we can reevaluate imperialism with different frameworks. The issue is that for the first time in human history, in the context of human well-being, we no longer have the luxury of time.
Thanks, Andrew. Ross.
Good afternoon. As it happens, I don't fly very often, but when I am, I'm often invited, or always invited, to offload my environmental sins by purchasing for a few pounds a carbon offset. My money could help to buy an Indian family a kerosene lamp, to replace their kerosene lamp with a solar-powered lamp, or buy a Kenyan a dung-powered generator. Or, like delegates at the 2005 G8 summit at Gleneagles, I could get a certificate showing that my carbon emissions had been offset by a scheme to replace the tin roofs in a shantytown suburb of Cape Town with a more insulating material. It's all very comforting for frequent flyers, save for one thing. Carbon offsetting only works so long, this particular example of carbon offsetting only works so long as the occupants of those tin huts carry on living in those tin huts, or others using their solar-powered lamps or dung-powered generators. The moment these people aspire to a Western lifestyle, tear down their huts and upgrade to a bungalow with a power shower, any carbon emissions that were saved by the exercise will instantly be lost. And of course, it only works in one direction. When your South African shantytown dweller grows rich enough to fly off on a foreign holiday, I can't see Al Gore being too pleased when a carbon offset company comes round to replace his central heating system with a dung-fired boiler. Which rather sums up the whole approach by which the West has adapted in its efforts to cut carbon emissions. We try to keep peoples in the developing world in a state of noble peasantry so that we can then carry on polluting with impunity. There has been a subtle change in the West's grand scheme to save the planet since the Kyoto Treaty was signed in 1997. Then the developing world was left out of the targets, carbon reduction targets, on the basis that their per capita emissions were a fraction of those in the West, and that it was our duty to set an example first. Now, after a decade of failing to set an example and cut our emissions, we have settled on an alternative policy. Let's delegate the business of cutting carbon emissions to the developing world instead. I wish I could have an air mile for every time I heard the expression, but the Chinese are building a power station every week, as an excuse for a Westerner to carry on driving his 4x4. There is, of course, a very good reason why the Chinese are rapidly building power stations, not merely because they aspire to the same living standards as we do, although that is true, but because a huge chunk of their carbon emissions are being spewed out in the cause of manufacturing goods for Western consumers. If we do ever manage to meet our carbon reduction targets in Britain, it will be thanks enormously to the fact that we've simply exported our carbon emissions to the Far East. Likewise, it has become fashionable to blame global warming on the removal of the Amazonian rainforest, neatly sidestepping the fact that much of Europe was once forested too, until we cleared it for agriculture. But God forbid if people elsewhere in the world want to clear their forests to compete with our agriculture. According to Al Gore, the Amazon is now a global resource which belongs to the whole world, but I can't see him somehow applying the same principle to the farmlands of Tennessee. Our attitude, to me, seems to be this: it's too late for us in the West to adjust our lifestyles. We're already addicted to fossil fuel usage, but what we can do is help the world's poor to lead their lives of environmental purity. I wish it were only humbug and hypocrisy But sadly, I feel there is a rather more dubious motive for some of what passes as environmental concern. Much of it is plain protectionism. The West opposes expansion of Brazilian agriculture into once forested areas because it doesn't want more competition for its own farmers. We try to get consumers to reduce their food miles, not because food which has travelled great distances to our tables has necessarily consumed more carbon in its production. It hasn't. Growing roses under glass in the Netherlands, for example, emits 60 times as much carbon emissions as growing them in Kenya. We do it because local food, low food miles, means local products. But worst of all, potentially, it would be a global carbon trading system. We will end up with the absurd situation where expanding industries in the developing world will be forced to buy permits from shrinking industries in the developed world, with well-fed carbon traders in the City of London taking a slice along the way. That was indeed one of Gordon Brown's great speeches on the matter of the environment. His conclusions seem to be that we must have a carbon trading system because it would be good for the City of London. I will rest my case there, and we will discuss this in greater depth later.
Thanks, Ross.
Sorry, could I just quickly ask if people could move towards the far side of the room so that it's easier for people coming in to sit down? Thank you.
I haven't started yet. We're all going.
Everyone comfortable, settled? Can I just ask, I don't know if there was a phone going off which was causing the feedback, so if we just remind everybody to switch off their mobile phones. Okay, so Kirk.
Thank you very much. I don't think it would be controversial to say that these days our engagement and appreciation of politics is continually shaped by global ethical issues. If you read the newspapers, you go on TV, you kind of listen to what politicians talk about, increasingly seems to be a kind of an international agenda, whether it's climate change, the war on terror, the war in Iraq, global poverty, the future of the rainforest, to name any issue. I mean, the list is pretty long. Politics seems to become more ethical and more global, and for many of us, all the better for it. I do think there are a few problems with this. We do seem to become, to an extent, kind of political tourists, and maybe dealing with some of the real problems in this country would be more important as a kind of better step forward, but I'll kind of leave that to aside for one moment. But I think that if there's one group in society who are keener to discuss ethical global issues more than anybody else, it's really the political elites, which I want to really talk about. Since the end of the Cold War, global ethical questions have formed the central tenet of foreign policy, I'd argue, and foreign policy has increasingly dominated domestic politics. What I'd like to do in my kind of short time here is really to critically investigate the reason behind the expansion of ethical policy making by Western governments on issues such as environment and issues like human rights. My main point is this, that this kind of global activism by the elites is not motivated by international largesse or really kind of valid responses to environmental emergencies. In fact, I'd argue most of them exaggerated. Or it's not pressure from new global civil society, new NGOs as such. Or no, it's not for that matter, green imperialism or eco-imperialism. I mean, my main point is this, is that the motivation for such ethical policy making lies in what it can achieve, not for our troubled planet, but for our troubled elites. At a time when the political stock of the elites is pretty low, the attraction of ethical grandstanding and moral policy making is really to bolster and enhance their own authority and legitimacy. International questions give them the opportunity, I'll explain, which domestic politics don't really offer. The international arena gives them space, they can make grand speeches, the global the better, the grander the better, whereas when they talk about the health service or they talk about schools or education, they can't really get that kind of authority amongst ourselves that international questions really give them. And finally, I will outline a few reasons why I think this kind of global ethical foreign policy of global environmental activism is pretty bad news. I think one of the most significant kind of cultural processes of the past 30 years has been the ascendancy of environmentalism. I mean, it's pretty fascinating to look back at how an idea that was ridiculed from left to right, marginal for decades, now dominates everywhere. I mean, one only has to look at the popularity of a mantra such as sustainability to really see how far the world has really changed. And although environmentalists have a kind of unfortunate tendency to suggest they're really kind of like plucky outsiders, kind of green Davids fighting red in tooth and claw Goliaths, I really think that environmentalism monopolises very much the kind of cultural imagination today, and increasingly shapes our lifestyles and increasingly shapes the political world. And I think the international arena gives us a real insight into this. Here we can see kind of ideas and positions adopted that previously only existed on the wider shores of the environmental movement. For example, take the increasing seriousness by which grave environmental emergencies are being added to the canons of responsibility to protect, R2P, and to the idea of sovereignty as responsibility. These two ideas, sovereignty as responsibility and R2P, suggest that states are not just responsible for the protection of their own citizens, but have a responsibility to the wider community. I mean, what this effectively means is that states have responsibility to protect environmental threats from impacting on the peace and security of other states. You know, ideas such as this suggest that if a state is unwilling or unable to basically deal with these problems, then sovereignty can be transferred to an external body such as the United Nations, effectively creating, I would argue, justifications for Western intervention. I mean, you may think this is pretty far-fetched and pretty ridiculous, but just think back a few months to the seriousness by which the French Foreign Minister, Bernard Kouchner, was when he basically argued that the Burmese government had to be forced, either by a barrel of a gun or a Apache helicopter, to accept Western aid. Remember, at the time, the Burmese government, for their own reasons, didn't want to accept Western aid, and Kouchner and the French Foreign Minister, the UN, basically suggested, well, if they won't accept it, we need to force it on them. However, this is one of my main points. This tendency, responsibility to protect, hasn't been formally ratified or codified by any kind of group or nations. It remains a kind of UN value, a kind of standing order for foreign policy. And this, I think, is incredibly dangerous. Without a kind of clear set of established rules, which policy making follows, and given that we live in a period of high degree of kind of subjectivity for international politics, often as responses to domestic political malaises, pretty much anything can't be ruled out. I think it's important to think about the time we're living through. We're at the start of a major economic crisis, which will see the reorganisation of global capitalism. This is clearly going to have a dramatic impact on our standard of living and our livelihoods here, but it's also likely, I think, to lead to an increase in international rivalries. I mean, one of the kind of unique characteristics of the past 20 years has been the unprecedented level of international peace and cooperation amongst the major capitalist powers. But if one looks back over the past century and the previous century, this is pretty atypical. And I don't think we can assume the same level of cooperation into the future. I think we'll likely see some kind of international reordering. And in light of this, I think we really do need to scrutinise our elites and what they do and examine the justifications they give. Because I think that'd be probably the most important task for progressive people in the future, to scrutinise what our elites are saying and what they're doing. So how would one explain, or how would I explain this kind of ethical activism? A few weeks ago I was shopping in Islington and I was stopped in the street by a rather kind of sweet and earnest young woman, who basically told me that God was concerned by the size of my ecological footprint, and that I'd be doing God's work if I kind of diminished it. Point of view. If you want to spend a fascinating 20 minutes, go onto Google, type in Church of England plus environmentalism, or type in CAV plus environmentalism, and you can really see how religion and the churches are really trying to reinvent themselves as the prophets of kind of eco-awareness. And I think the Vatican City is about to become the first carbon neutral state. Although obviously it's a little street, effectively. But I mean, you know, they want to be prophets of eco-awareness. Obviously, they may have a kind of a tussle with the kind of secular prophets of Greenpeace and George Monbiot, but you kind of get the picture that they're trying to, you know, really use environmentalism to reinvent themselves in a sense. And I think the church, like other institutions, are promiscuously using environmentalism as a means to renew themselves and their relationship to us. And I think for the churches, as the churches, for the political elites, and I think governments, as we all do, are kind of feeling the kind of lack of kind of social connectedness with society, and they don't have Facebook. And I think they're trying to use environmentalism as one point of kind of contact with us. And I think, for me, that's the rationale for this kind of global ethical policy making, trying to make potential contacts with us. I think the dramatic changes in the international order since the end of the Cold War provide the opportunity for this to happen. But I think the reason for it, the kind of driving force for it, is not necessarily a response to the outside world. It's more to do with events in the domestic sphere. And I think for the political elite, the attraction of kind of ethical foreign policy is that, in one sense, talk is cheap. You know, they are freed from any kind of responsibility for what happens. You know, the outcomes of their initiatives are pretty kind of, you know, insignificant in one sense. And I think sounding stuff on the international stage is easier than solving the turmoil in the financial markets. You know, I think that that's important, but for me the most important thing is that, you know, we're living through a period of profound kind of moral illiteracy, when people find it very difficult to distinguish between good and evil, and I think environmentalism really plays that role. And at a time when self-conscious categories of right and wrong are not immediately available, you know, environmentalism really plays that. And I think, you know, on the surface it seems pretty clear what is right and wrong about big dams and deforestations and the resettlement of people. And I think that's one of the real roles that environmentalism plays today. Finally, a couple of quick reasons why I think this is bad. Firstly, you know, the moralising of the environment and the politicising of the environment leads to the creation of moral and immoral countries. You know, the approach of dividing the world into moral and immoral nations helps legitimise actions by the former against the latter. It set up nations as pariahs, and history shows what happens when we demonise countries. And secondly, I think this kind of process creates a real sense of permanent crisis. I mean, increasingly, every environmental issue is a must-do. You know, this is our last chance to save the planet. The clock is ticking. We have 100 days to save the planet. This is the worst catastrophe since the last one. Everything is like must be done. And this kind of rush to action, I think, is particularly dangerous. And I think that we really do need to question a lot of the motives and the actions that are put forward by our elites when they demand that we rush to judgment on the environment.
Thanks, Kirk. I should also add Kirk was put the panel together, so thanks to Kirk for producing, for giving us the opportunity to have this debate. Okay, before I bring in you guys, I just want to draw out a few themes on the panel. So particularly with Ross and Andrew. Ross, you seem to be very skeptical of kind of many of the environmental homilies and platitudes that are bandied about, and seeing kind of more kind of traditional Realpolitik considerations underneath, considerations of wealth, considerations of protectionism, these kinds of things. While Andrew, on the other hand, and please, you know, like, correct me if I'm putting words in your mouth, but you seem to suggest that if imperialism is the cost of saving the planet, so be it. If there's the right ethical, if it has this ethical basis, then, and if it means dominating other countries, in the interests of ensuring the survival of the biosphere and all the rest of it, then you're happy to counter, you know, that doesn't trouble you so much. So I'd be interested to hear, I mean, do you think, so first to Ross, is it really, can you characterize it as a new form of imperialism, or is it just kind of traditional kind of power politics? And to Andrew, I want just to draw you out, if you really do think, and that's very straightforward, that if that's the cost, so be it.
Well, I think the point Kirk made is I think the point that Kirk made is absolutely true. That for world leaders, the issue of environmentalism is a tremendous comfort. I mean, there are so many issues which, you know, a leader will spend his days, which will make him tremendously unpopular in his own country. The very, very difficult issues, financial law and so on. the one thing that leader will tend to gravitate towards an issue which they can seem good, magnanimous, unite people, and take it to the global stage. And I think a lot behind the sort of modern fashion for environmentalism really has its origins in leaders finding things too difficult at home. If you've got a credit crunch on, why not fly off and make a platitudinous speech in Zambia or wherever. I think there's the very hard example of what Kirk was saying was at the 2002 Earth Summit in Johannesburg. Most of the developing world nations interpreted that summit. They wanted to talk about free trade. They wanted to talk about opening up agricultural markets so they could sell goods to the West. Western leaders had a completely different idea of it. What they did, they ignored, a lot of them, Blair and Bush and so on, actually ignored the debate on free trade. They just flew in for the day they were debating climate change. Had a few pictures for the cameras and then flew out again.
Okay. Andrew?
Thank you. Well, I mean, what I was trying to raise in my talk was really the issue of semantics around the terms that we actually use, like imperialism, like domination, both of which carry very negative connotations in today's society. But I mean, of course, we live in an international global world where power relationships between states and domination between states exists and will continue to exist. Even in a new world order, we're going to have that kind of relationship. What I was really trying to illuminate and question was the basis of the domination. What type of domination is that? If it's domination that is based upon disadvantaging people in developing countries, if it's based upon loss of democracy, racism, loss of human rights, then I'm totally against that. But if we call domination a kind of domination that involves countries, richer countries, helping people to actually develop, have livelihood opportunities to conserve nature, then that kind of domination, I would say, is not necessarily a negative kind of domination. So it is to do with the semantics of the terms. But I feel that there are pressing problems. I mean, Kirk was inferring that the environmental problems that we face don't necessarily have the tight deadlines that we're led to believe. And you correct me if I'm wrong, Kirk, but I mean that's what I inferred. But science has some kind of role in trying to inform aspects of human behaviour and the social world. And certainly if you look at reports from the IPCC, if you look at the Stern Review, it's hard to ignore the fact that there is a time element to this which is quite pressing. And there are major problems that we face that we do have to address within certainly this century, if not the next 50 years. And the question that I'm trying to raise is the ethical framework that we actually use to address those questions. What's the basis of that? And that's how I see it being very important in determining whether this term of eco-imperialism is representative of something like Dreysen says in his book, Green Power, Black Death, which is a very evocative term, or whether it is something that is actually beneficial to humans, to the other sentient and non-sentient beings, so the rest of the natural world as well.
Okay, so the question of how we reconcile the needs and rights of humanity with the moral claims of other forms of life on the panel. I just want to pick one thing up with what Kirk was saying. You were suggesting that you seem to be suggesting that there is kind of no traditional Realpolitik or clearly kind of articulated Realpolitik motivating environmental politics on the international stage, and that it's and that most of this stuff is actually not the response to environmental problems, but a response to a more kind of deeper political issue, particularly in the West. So you think there are no issues of domination between big countries and small countries, or it is purely springs from within Western countries themselves, and there's no level of analysis we need to include on the international level?
Well, it's a good question. I think for myself, the debate exists on two levels. I've done some work on an issue which is environmental security, where issues of the environment have kind of merged with kind of security discussions. And there's within the discipline itself, there's a real kind of to and fro. Some people are for the idea of kind of merging of kind of environmental questions like deforestation and climate change and environmental migration, people leaving their country to another country because of environmental problems. Some argue that should be part of the kind of security discussion. On the other hand, you have those who think it shouldn't be, that if you include everything within security, then security means everything and it means nothing. So there is a kind of to and fro about the debate. But what's interesting beneath the debate is, although both sides think that they're for or against the discussion, beneath it, they all agree that the ideas of kind of state sovereignty have had their day. That although they may disagree about how we deal with environmental security questions, beneath it, both sides argue that, the international community or Western nations have a duty and responsibility to, recognise the state sovereignty, the democratic aspirations of people is less important than it used to be. And I think that indicates how the world has changed, and that it's not like an open declaration, but it accepts the fact that this should take place. And I think that some of the points I raised about responsibility to protect and sovereignty and responsibility really kind of fit into that. So that's on one level. But I do think there is a real tendency to exaggerate a lot of the environmental problems. Take one, for example, which is species loss. Every 2 or 3 years, reports come out from kind of international environmental organisations saying how many mammals are alive, we need to look after this creature, that creature. And it leads to kind of newspaper stories, big debates. And then you go back in it, and all their kind of predictions of what's going to happen never seem to take place. And if you go back like 150 years, and you read like Darwin, it makes about that 95% of the creatures that have ever existed in the world have already gone, and most of them are not due with kind of like man's impact. Now clearly in parts of the world there are certain creatures that we need to have a debate about whether we think that those creatures should survive, should we spend money on it, should we have nature reserves, should we have wildlife reserves. But increasingly those debates take place kind of like above the interests of people. An example, I wrote an article in The Guardian last week about a film about the IRA hunger strike. And there was about 80 people wrote in, most of them didn't like the article and said, horrible things about the hunger strikers. But about a month ago I wrote an article for The Guardian which basically argued that rather than kick Indian people off their land, we should farm tigers. And more people responded to that Guardian article than they did about the IRA hunger strike. And they're basically saying that yes, we should definitely not farm tigers. Indian people breed too much. We need to kick them off the land. We need to move them into cities. Should do this and do that. So I think the debate has really changed. That there's certain things which you wouldn't have accepted or thought about in the past are now part of the mainstream.
Okay. Do we have roving mics? Yeah. Just please do remember to keep your points succinct so we can get a few people in. So let's start with the man in the middle with the beard. Yeah, the man here. No. the guy with the beard and the ponytail.
Thank you. I just want to say, if we're speaking about eco-imperialism and imperialism specifically, I think it's important also to recognize the environmental concerns that come from both the global south and the global north. And I think an interesting example I have in my mind is Nigeria, where you have the Ogoni struggle, which was a peaceful, self-proclaimed environmental struggle, which was crushed, which the leader was executed. And meanwhile, now you have the struggle, a violent conflict which has broken out in the Niger Delta. Meanwhile, you have Shell, which has been operating since independence. They are reinventing themselves on TV. Every night you watch CNN, you see sustainable development brought to you by Royal Dutch Shell. And if, as the elites in the north, I like Kirk's point, it's very easy for them to take these global issues of biodiversity and climate change and use it to their advantage without looking at the actual players within the north who support them and their political agenda and putting them on the pressure for the impact that they're having. And meanwhile, the voices of environmental struggles in various parts of the South are ignored at the global, in the global forum kind of. So I think it's very important to kind of look at the impact that people in the North and the transnational connections that are happening, that the impact we have and the corporations based in the North have. Meanwhile, the Southern voices and environmental concerns that are kind of left out of the debate and that cause conflict, as we've seen in the Niger Delta, which went from a peaceful environmental movement, which has now moved to violent conflict and, is reducing reducing all kind of oil outputs, and they've declared total war on the state. So I just wanted to, if anyone wants to comment about that.
Okay, thank you. There's some interesting issues there about Southern activism and also the role of multinationals. The other man with the beard, but he's got glasses.
Yes, I have. I'm a bit puzzled about ethics. I just wanted to ask about that. Andrew, you contrasted ecocentric ethics versus anthropocentric ethics with your example of the community that wanted to destroy a coral reef in the interest of their economic development. Well, I'm sort of flummoxed completely by the idea of ecocentric ethics. I don't know what they are. If we say that anthropocentric ethics are a human thing, and I can see how we might debate and contest and have differences of opinion and interest over what should be done. But it's almost as if you're suggesting that ecocentric ethics are above that they're somehow given by nature itself, or that perhaps the C of E would have us think that they're given by God. So surely they must also be a human construct. Isn't it just a way of, perhaps along the lines that Kirk was suggesting, a way of talking about right and wrong, which presents itself as somehow uncontestable above matters of politics and interest, but which surely must be actually about making judgments on the basis of, human interests and human politics and human ideas.
Thank you. Yes, the lady in the middle.
Kerry Dingle, World Right. A few quick things. I don't think Kirk was suggesting this, and I think it's important we should recognise that when we talk about the elite's ethical grandstanding and environmentalism plays that role, it's not a kind of feel-good greenwash any more than the corporates going down the environmental road is greenwash. I think we should be clear they really do think these things and believe these things and understand the extent to which the kind of disenchantment with capitalism and with their own system means that these things are entirely consistent. A set of principles that is about limits in terms of what we can do fits with a negative view of what's possible, which is persistent across our elites. So they're not just taking it on board. And I became very aware of that in the early 80s, in the middle of the Amazon, when Shell, who had recently entirely shipped out their external affairs department and taken on a new sort of breed, were massively funding Pro Natura, a sort of very middle-class, green welly type environmental outfit, and had also just done a huge experiment with 50 NGOs in Peru to support what was known as the Camisa project, where they prevented any indigenous labour, building of roads or infrastructure coming out of the digging of gas within Peru. And it was amazing that they would sit there and explain to us how great this was, that there was going to be no social or environmental impact from this gas pipeline, when what was very evident was that people in Peru desperately wanted the roads, the jobs, and everything else. So I think it's quite important that we realise the extent to which these people mean things. A couple of very, very quick points. Andrew, I'd like to know what you mean by positive domination, because I can't think of any. It's quite an incredible idea. And also, I disagree with Rob here in the middle on his southern environmentalism, because whether it's the Chico Mendes story in Brazil or the Inuit and their wanting the oil when the WWF ran a participatory scheme and thought they'd vote against it and they didn't, or whether it's the Ogoni, environmentalism in the South is not the same thing as we know it. It is about getting your hands on the cash rather than supporting the idea of limiting what we can have. And I do think that the environmentalism is a new justification for North-South inequality and should be challenged on that basis.
Thanks. Can you give it to the man in front of you?
Yeah, Ross, you talk about, and I think everybody in the room probably agrees, that Al Gore's hypocrisy saying, the rainforests are a global resource. But then you negate the possibility and the plausibility of possible payment for that resource. I mean, for instance, oil is a global resource, but we pay OPEC for it. Similarly, couldn't we therefore find some way of paying the people who own this resource, like the rainforests, for maintaining that resource? If it's going to pay, rather than having agricultural encroachment, then they will adhere to it for very good economic reasons. We then turn the whole debate from eco-imperialism to eco-free trade.
Thank you. If you could just pass it back to that gentleman there, yeah.
Yeah, just in the discussion about imperialism and national rights, what often happens is what is not discussed is more enlightening than what is discussed. So I happen to work in the same area as Andrew, and what you will find is paper after paper in things like the Journal of Sustainable Tourism, Journal of Ecotourism, all the books published by Routledge and Cabien, etc., all talking about the normative building block, which will almost always be a small, marginalised rural community in the developing world. And I'd put 20 quid that on between now and the end of the year, none of those papers and books will have any discussion, not even feel the need to mention the sovereignty of the nations that they're talking about. There'll be case study after case study in the developing world without any discussion of the national sovereignty of the states or the countries that those case studies are being studied and put into place. And that's totally in contrast to the way that we look at development over here in the West. So there's people feel no compulsion to address what we would consider natural, which would be our national sovereignty.
Thank you. Okay, let's take two more, and then I'll go out for another round. So just the gentleman behind you, and then the gentleman over here.
Please, could we have comments on the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and its processes and carbon taxation?
Thank you. Just if you could just get the mic up here, and then I'll bring the panel in. There's some very specific issues addressed to particular speakers, which I'll bring the speakers back in to address those points.
Those beings could then have representation in a court of law for their right to existence. And that could be used as a means of legal redress to possible development issues. That's very isolated in practice at the moment, but it is getting certainly a lot of attention. If you look in some of the legal practices in California, for example, this idea of earth jurisprudence and trying to get the rights to existence written into a stronger legal framework than presently exists. And that would raise some very interesting questions then about our rights compared to the rights of other animals.
Could I just ask, would a tree represent itself in court, or would a human represent a tree?
No, but the tree would have difficulty.
But that's the point. It's a human idea. So the whole idea of giving
it's a human construct completely. Yeah.
But
But it's recognised. What it's extending is a recognition of an intrinsic right to existence that is independent of humans actually granting that right. So that's the difference, even though the construct is human in terms of the eco-ethics. The actual basis of it is that there is a right to existence that extends beyond our right to give that.
So there's a problem here, isn't there, that whenever one creature is suppressed, there's usually another creature which benefits from the suppression of the first creature. So I mean, if you're going to have a sort of a legal system to protect maybe the hyenas would rather like it if the tigers were driven out of existence, or the sort of wildebeest would rather enjoy the tigers being driven to extinction.
But I'm not sure that's. There is that kind of argument, but I mean the argument is what do you actually have in terms of your ecosystem to begin with, and that's the issue that we face in terms of trying to recognise what extent the ecosystem has been altered or not altered by actions.
But I don't think nature has an existence outside of ourselves. I mean, if I go to the Brazilian rainforest, I see beautiful trees, fantastic creatures, lovely water. If I live there, I might see that as my larder. I might see that as a problem. So I think outside of what we make of it, nature just has no existence. So I think it's just another way of trying to create a new kind of secular religion as such, if you like, because it's an attempt to create a new morality around something which, there seems to be a certain kind of urgency and desperation to do.
Well, to an extent, but then if you take the issue of slavery, I mean, there was a massive readjustment in the ethical framework and morality and legality of slavery. And you could argue that that was just a new issue that, was something to actually address, and underwriting that would be a range of political processes that will work in someone's benefit.
But I think you have to make a distinction between humans and trees. I mean, that's where I'm coming from.
But that's the viewpoint, isn't it? That's the difference in the viewpoint.
But I mean, let me just to be clear. I mean, these extension of rights to animals and trees, whatever. I mean, do you support it? Are you for it? You think it's the right way to go, or you don't see that there are dangers that kind of other claims can be smuggled in under the guise of these kinds of these extending these rights to creatures and beings that aren't able to actually do anything themselves, aren't able to make any claims themselves?
I think it's a very difficult. It's a difficult concept, and it's a difficult argument, and it's not a clear argument of being right or wrong. I mean, it depends on contexts and situations, and of course, it's always going to be difficult if that you get then the issue where those rights are where the rights of other sentient, non-sentient beings are actually dictating against benefits to humans, and how do you actually address that? But what it does do is to make you think about other ways, other strategies for achieving development that isn't necessarily based upon the exploitation of nature like we've had in the past.
A concrete example of where this will take us, there's a group in Central Africa who are basically trying to, and for a long period of time, are trying to create a nation for, I think it's Highland gorillas. And the problem they've got is obviously if you kind of stake out this kind of new nation for Highland gorillas, it's in more than one country. So as soon as you have this conception that the Highland gorillas should have a nation, you're now, having to kind of like take a part of this country, take a part of that country. And it just indicates that once you have this kind of, once you break a distinction between like the rights of humans and the rights of animals, where that leads you into this kind of terrible kind of mess.
Well, I mean, the thing is, I mean, it's not white or black. I mean, there are different shades of this. I mean, it's not a straightforward argument of, one against the other. There are different shades and different degrees of rights and recognition, because it is a human construct at the end of the day. But what I'm saying is that when you begin to introduce this into environmental arguments or environmental law, it certainly raises some interesting questions about how you actually move forward with development. And it certainly makes you rethink, perhaps, some of the strategies that have been employed in the past, which have led to environmental destruction. They're no longer within that kind of ethical or legal framework would be an acceptable approach to how you move forward.
What do you make of this, Ross?
Well, I think it's. I very much dislike the idea of the extension of a sort of legal framework to which. Extending that to non-humans, I think it's completely meaningless. It creates enough trouble. We try and have a sort things out in a sort of this kind of, intense legal context with human disagreements. But, take the example Kirk said of the gorillas, trying to create a nation for gorillas. I mean, does anyone ask the gorillas whether a nation state is the appropriate way that they wish to administrate their affairs? I think ask a few people in the world, they would say a nation state is not the ideal way to organise human affairs. Can I go on and address the?
Yeah, briefly. If you just want to comment briefly.
Yes, the chap in the middle. So we made the suggestion we should be paying to preserve the Amazonian rainforest. Oh, it's a good point. I mean, if we're going to ask people to do something, it's quite right that we put up the money. But I mean, you could end up in problems here, though. You could say at the furthest, the most obvious thing. Well, if we want to preserve the rainforest, why don't we in the West buy it? But you would get a pretty objectionable situation then when Western nations sort of owned half of Brazil. It was sort of, that would be the most imperialistic option of the lot in the end, to have financial control over other nations.
But don't Donalds already do that. They have huge swathes of land in Brazil where they cultivate beasts for their rotting hamlet.
Yeah, well, yeah. Well, I think that there's a difference where you then sort of put, I accept that there might be a problem where one corporation owns large tracts of land, but I don't think any corporation is ever going to likely to own as large a stretch as would happen if we sort of, lifted this sort of concept up into a sort of national. If we're going to we're going to try and save the rainforest, if you like, that's such massive areas of land that it would, it would amount to a complete corporate takeover of those nations involved.
Okay, let's see hands. Where's my roving mic? There you go. Okay, let's start at the front because we didn't get questions from the front last time. So these two in front.
Okay, my question's for Andrew. I'm getting a bit confused by your argument because you seem to be kind of arguing for this kind of intrinsic moral worth of nature and of kind of the right to existence for these gorillas or whatever, yet you're kind of denying any intrinsic moral worth to ideas like slavery is bad or domination's good or bad. I'm just a bit confused by which way you're looking at that.
Viv from Worldwide. Wow. I don't think it's got any human interest in it, in your idea about giving rights to trees and stuff. And actually, it's not a new idea, is it? Because I remember reading this book, and it says something like, in medieval times, they took villages to court, a particular village to court, because they were killing the rats, because the rats were eating their harvest. And they actually took the villagers to court and won the case on the rats' side because the rats were there first. So it's just deeply anti-human and frightening and weird. But I also thought I'd like to just ask the panel about the idea of this eco-imperialism, because on one hand I can absolutely see that. Really, when people bang on about kind of McDonaldizing, the developing world, and we're, this Western imperialism onto the developing world, that's nonsense in the sense that the only thing that's been exporting from here is kind of notions of traditional culture and sustainable development, and things like that. And I can see the danger it's doing to us all, and particularly the developing world. But how much is it? Because I agree with you, Kirk. They're not doing any largesse. It's not like the times of before where they actually believed in something and going off and fighting for that and making sure that, hoping that everybody else would agree and it would be a world domination. So what is it? Is imperialism a word that we should be using at all? And what is the dangers there?
Thanks. There were some people here around the middle. Yep.
I was just wondering if somebody could comment about future generations, because it seems to me that quite a lot of what comes up when we're talking about trying to save the world is that if we're over 30, we may as well not bother because we'll probably die before we completely kill it. And so it might be interesting to talk about why we have to conserve it in a very human way for our future generations.
Any other questions? Okay, I want to bring, bringing the panelists back in, I wanted to get Ross to address this issue, because you seem to be very skeptical of a lot of the claims made for international environmentalism. But I mean, are you skeptical of environmentalism in general, or do you think, I mean, there are immediate kind of issues that we need to address practically and deliberately and decisively, maybe in the West or maybe in some other way? I just wanted to get a better sense of the balance in which you see.
Yeah. Well, first, let's separate out the sort of micro-environmental issues, some of which have been raised, which are problems in particular parts of the world of soil degradation or whatever, and the big thing, which is the idea that carbon emissions are warming up the Earth. on that second big issue, I mean, I avoided the issue in my opening remarks, but I mean, this is my position. I think it is absolutely inconceivable, barring war, pestilence, or some other calamity, that the world is going to reduce carbon emissions in the next 50 years. I mean, you've just got to look at the number of people who are aspiring to lift their living standards to those of the West, relative to the number of people already in the West, have living standards of that level. And it's an impossible thing. You cannot, give everybody a few energy-efficient light bulbs and reduce carbon emissions. As living standards increase around the world, there is going to be a huge increase in carbon emissions. You can probably, counter that to the tune 5-10%, this sort of thing. But, Kyoto Treaty, I mean, Bjorn Lomborg makes this point quite a lot, that if all the provisions in the Kyoto Treaty were adhered to, it would delay global warming by 6 years. So instead of, drowning by the year 2100, we would drown in the year 2106. That there is only one practical solution to the issue of global warming, and that is adaptation. And basically, by adapting to climate change, basically, the richer you are, the more able you are going to be to adapt to climate change. So suppressing economic growth, which so much of green ideology seems to be about, is going to put people in far more danger than letting the economy grow. If you're a rich country, you build seawalls, you can have early flood warning systems and all this sort of thing. I'm skirting around the other side of the debate. Is it actually happening? And if anyone wants to take up that, it's probably beyond the scope of this debate, but I'm quite happy to do so.
We've already got imperialism floating around as an idea. Now we can get climate change denial as well, and just really kind of get everybody heated and slinging around the insults. Andrew, did you want to come back?
Well, I don't want to get bogged down in this thing about environmental ethics, because it's just a little part of my talk. But I mean, it's about the extension of our duties and rights of nature, and how we actually judge that and how we look at it. And I'm just saying that there is a case, and it certainly is happening, that is not a thing that is being ignored in terms of the rights of nature to an existence, and it will come more into consideration over the course of the next decades in law. I'm absolutely convinced about that. But I would say about the general case of, I was also asked a question about the idea of positive domination. And, this is where I came back to the matter of these semantics that we're looking at: domination, imperialism, hegemony, the relationship between countries. I mean, it is a question of frameworks of how we're actually judging these things, whether they're good or whether they're bad. Can domination be positive? If an environmental, non-governmental organisation actually developed a scheme where it enhanced the livelihoods of people, it protected the rainforest where they were living through doing that, it gave them development opportunities that didn't exist, would that be a bad kind of imperialism? These are the kinds of issues that do come up in this. We're living in a very complicated world. I do agree with Ross that, I mean, the adaptive measures are probably the only way that we are, of course, going to actually deal with the problems of global warming, and those that are wealthier are far better off to actually deal with the problems of global warming, both at an individual level and a national level, than those that aren't. However, I would draw a word of caution about Lomborg's book, The Sceptical Environmentalist, because that has been very derided in scientific circles as not being very worthy of serious scientific consideration.
Kirk, do you want to...
I think the term eco-imperialism is a great term, and I wish I'd kind of got there first, because it's useful. But I think in a sense, it's a bit of a deceit in the title of the sessions. I don't really think as such it exists. I mean, it suggests a kind of a confident and a strong Western elite who really know where their interests lie in the world and what they really stand for. And I think everywhere you look, that doesn't really seem to be clear. And, you know, I think that whereas one of the back is right, that some of the elites really believe in what they're doing, I think it's quite hollow. And I think they'd rather talk about it than do anything. It's much easier, and for them, it's much better to actually talk about these kind of grand schemes of healing the scar of Africa, or, you know, ending poverty by this date, or whatever kind of thing. They'd rather talk as grand and as global, because it gives them a sense of gravitas, gives themselves a sense of confidence, gives themselves a sense to relate to us. But in reality, actually do something about it is pretty difficult. And I'm not even too sure they know what needs to be done. So I think they'd rather talk about it and act in that sense than actually, you know, do anything about it. And that's quite important. There is a kind of like strong narcissistic aspect to this whole thing. And I think that when you see them actually on the ground, I mean, look how quick Miliband went off to Africa. I mean, undoubtedly there are problems there, but one has to suggest that he's gone there to really be seen to be doing something rather than actually doing something. I mean, the last thing the Brits want to do is send troops there, you know. So I think in a sense they would rather be making these grand schemes because it looks fantastic, but actually when it gets down to it, it's much more difficult to deliver. But being exposed by not delivering is much easier on the international stage and all these questions than it is about improving crime in London or the health system or the education system. It's much easier to talk internationally than do things domestically.
Okay, questions from the floor on some of those issues. There's a gentleman here in the front.
I think that part of the problem is that governments are slightly impotent to actually make changes in this, because like, the problem of increasing climate change is due to Western consumerism, whereas like the ethical issues reside in the fact that if we
speak up a bit.
Sorry, I think governments are impotent to actually exact change in this area, because like the like Western consumerism is what drives climate change, but our ideas of the eco-imperialism and sustainable development for the developing world are solutions, whereas like there's no more of the power for the sort of micro.
Okay, if you thanks, but if you pass it to the gentleman there. Yeah.
I'm struck by just how negative the debate has been so far, and this sort of near denial of any possibility of making a positive contribution to CO2 emissions being reduced. I mean, there is technology that will remove CO2 from the atmosphere. There is technology which will generate electricity using solar concentrated power, which has been around 100 years. There are solutions, technological and political and other solutions to the carbon problem, which and it seems to be complete denial either of that there's any hope of affecting positively our environmental impact, and that seems to me to be just counterintuitive and going against all the evidence very strong evidence actually that we could make a difference. And indeed there is an ethical I mean, we've got grandchildren, some of us, and we might have, if we haven't already. We've got a moral obligation, I think, to try and do what we can to remove as much of the environmental damage that we're doing as possible. And one of the reasons that you've been putting forward to why we shouldn't address these issues is because there might be free riders. You know, Shell, horror of horrors, may put some adverts in the newspaper and say, oh, you know, aren't we wonderful, Shell, you know. And so because we don't want free riders on our bus, we're saying let's not travel. Well, that doesn't make sense, you know. Let's travel because we've got to travel, because we've got a moral obligation to. And if there are free riders, then I absolutely agree with your argument about people like Tony Blair and so on, you know, grandstanding to their own political advantage rather than actually deeply wanting to address the environmental issues. But let's make the bus travel. Let's have Tony Blair on it. Let's have Shell on it if we have to. And let's meanwhile shout and criticise them, perhaps. But there's no reason to say because we've got free free riders, the bus won't go. And we're just going to, and just be utterly cynical about anybody who wants to change anything positively, because we've got a moral obligation to make those changes, however difficult. And I don't think, saying, your argument that we shouldn't actually address, the best way of addressing climate change is to make everybody richer. So let's screw up. That's the only way of fixing the planet is to screw it up. It just doesn't add up. There are ways forward. Anyway, that's enough.
Just pass the mic to the gentleman behind you.
That's a bit funny because I was going to say something rather to the opposite of that, but not wishing to react. But it is important to kind of put in perspective, I think, what the IPCC has said and indeed what the scientific community has said. Bearing in mind we're talking about an extrapolation from a change in global temperature of less than 1 degree centigrade that's measured. And the IPCC gives various projections about where it might go in the future. That human CO2 emissions are less than 5% of the total natural CO2 emissions. So to alter the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, you've got a pretty small margin you can affect anyway, because we're only responsible for 5%. None of this is to downplay, technology can do some great things, but it can't necessarily fix a problem that doesn't exist, I'm not saying that there's no problem, but the problem of that we will all drown by the year 2100 just is not in the ballpark. There is no sense in which sea levels will swamp any substantial part of the planet by 2100. That simply is not what the IPCC says. It projects a growth of about, a metre of seawater. And Al Gore says 10 metres, so that is the exaggeration that's the problem. And I think there is a real difficulty when we say that we should try and stop climate change, because that's insane. You cannot stop climate change. Just try and imagine the world without climate change, where it would always be autumn. Harvesting would be over. Climate change is part of human civilization. It's why we're not Neanderthal. It's because if there were no climate change, we would still be by the sea eating mollusks with the Neanderthals, because our ancestors responded to climate change. So we need to respond to climate change and make it part. And in truth, that's what we've done. Archaeologists right now are looking at farms in the North Sea. They're looking at farms in the North Sea from when that was a land bridge, when our ancestors were farming in that area, where you could walk from Newcastle to Denmark. And the climates do change over time, and we need to, they always have, and we need to incorporate that into our plans for the future. Where we can mitigate excess CO2 emissions, we ought to, but we don't need to be paralysed by a sense that we are all going to drown tomorrow, because nothing like that is going to happen.
Thank you very much. Questions? We're drawing to a close now, so this is the final round of questions. So if you've got an issue that you want to bring up, then please do so now. Though again, please keep it succinct, because I want to come back to the panel. So that guy there.
Hi. Much of the debate so far has framed the issues in terms of conflict of interests, or a perceived conflict of interest between North and South. And while certainly that's a major element of environmental politics, I'd like to suggest if and when climate change does occur, there will be differences of interests within the North and within the South. It's likely that Canada and Russia will benefit from putative climate change, as certain areas of permafrost defrost and certain sea resources become available, especially around the Arctic. But places like the Netherlands might be less lucky. And likewise in the South, industrial growth around the coastal regions of China might greatly benefit the average Chinese person. But if that produces carbon which causes climate change in Bangladesh, I think it's clear that there'll be trade-offs within the South as well.
Thank you. Any final comment, question, point from the floor? No?
So I would just like to return the debate very quickly to this idea of authentic conversation and change of ideas between Southern environmental concerns, be they brown or green agendas, and Northern environmental concerns, which are kind of taken on this ethical grandeur of assuming that they're saving the world, and how transnational corporations, Shell or whoever, or power-based that have grown out of imperialism, if we want to talk about imperialism, what power structures they even inherited, and how if they are going to be on the bus and we're all going to ride this bus together, how those power structures and avenues for discourse need to be very critically examined. And I don't think it's like one big happy bus, everyone get on, North and South. People in the South have their own specific agendas in specific places, and until those voices are heard in an authentic way in governing bodies that can address the issues, we're not going to get anywhere with this. And if it's going to be dominated by eco-ethics and this and, you know, abstract ideas and abstract concepts that fill politicians or governing bodies with this grandeur, then it's not going to go anywhere. So I'd just like to bring the issue back to this discourse between North and South and the conflict of interest that exists there.
Okay, now the hands. Okay, very quickly, two last questions. The gentleman there and then the gentleman at the far back.
I just wanted to come back on the, the rights for trees idea, which, and I think the person who made this point has left, but that is a medieval worldview, and there were indeed trials of animals and insects and so on. So it's not, I don't think it's true to say what you're claiming, that this is a kind of forward-looking extension of human rights and freedoms, and now we've got a much more kind of sophisticated idea, and we can even grant rights to inanimate objects maybe, and so on. I think it's a very backward view. It's a pre-Enlightenment view. It's harking back to a time when we didn't see humanity as being at the centre, and it's telling that kind of view should be popular now, and in the kind of environmentalist politics, which takes a very, as people have said, a very kind of anti-human outlook. Rights for cheese sandwiches, I say.
Thank you. And then finally, just the gentleman at the far back.
I just wanted to tell you a little story about a holiday I went on to Tanzania.
Story.
It's very quick, and it does make a point. When I was in Tanzania last December, I had the chance to take my children to see some monkeys in a nearby forest that was suggested at the hotel, and I thought that might be a nice thing to do. And when I got to this forest, it turned out that it was a kind of enclosed forest that had been promoted as an environmental area in cooperation with various Western NGOs, to the expense of the local population, who were no longer able to go to that part of the forest to collect firewood and to use it, as was mentioned on the panel, as their larder. I think there has been an element in the discussion that sometimes these things are kind of abstract ideas that the Western elite can benefit from. But for local populations, you can see the real problems that caused, where they were restricted in their ability to collect food for the forests, basically to give the monkeys rights in Tanzania, that the monkeys had the rights to use the forest rather than the local people. So my question to the panel is, who was the eco-imperialist? Was it me taking my kids to the forest to see the monkeys? Is it the local population trying to use the forest? Or is it the monkeys, or is it the Western NGOs?
Thank you. Okay, I'll get the panel to give their closing statements. Just a couple of minutes each to wrap things up. We'll go in the same order that we had that we went, and I just throw one question from myself into the mix if the panel want to address it, which is just to get some sense. I mean, the man at the back just mentioned the difference between the kind of abstract talk on one level about globalization, global solutions, eco-ethics and all this stuff, and the very concrete reality of how these things play out on the ground and impact people's lives in developing countries. And so I'd like to hear what the panel, if either what they concrete responses to that, concrete illustrations of that, and just what actually how these things play out concretely beyond the kind of beyond the broad trends that they've already discussed. So if we go once again, we'll begin with Andrew.
Well, there's a lot to address very quickly, but I mean the issue of sustainable development, the issue of future generations' welfare is obviously part of this equation, as is the technological responses to the environmental problems we have, which have a vital part to play. And can be people in a much better place to adapt to those problems than not. For example, the Netherlands has been able to build dike defences. Bangladesh won't have that luxury. So rising sea levels could be an issue in somewhere like Bangladesh. In the terms of environmental ethics, then, I mean, I'm not an advocate of sort of nutty environmental ethics, where those actually dictate a sort of way that ruins people's lives. What I'm advocating is the fact that we need a broader consideration of the environment of nature than we've had in the past. Because if we accept that we do have problems, which some people may not accept, but we accept that we do have environmental problems which have anthropogenic causes, then we have to ask why and what are we going to do about that. And we can address that through politics, we can address it through economics, but we have to address it through legal procedure as well. So you can't ignore the question of ethics and you can't ignore the question of rights. And in the case of Tanzania, where the situation is dictating against the livelihoods of local people, and I would say it's quite clear that there has to be some way of addressing that, because that, in my view, is not right, that local people should be losing out at the benefits of environmental conservation. I would never advocate that. So.
Thank you. Ross.
Right. If I could respond quickly to the gentleman there on his carbon neutral bus, that I don't have a negative view of mankind's future at all. What's tremendously positive for me over the past decade is that large parts of Asia and the Far East are lifting themselves into going through the sort of industrializing process, which has, enriched the West with with the result we live longer, we have fewer infant deaths and all the rest. And it seems strange to me that anybody should want to hinder that process at all, which I rather fear that the Green lobby or certain sections of it would love to do. Backed up by this, what I would see as a rather dubious theory of global warming. I'll just touch on this very, very, very briefly. We always call these predictions of sea level rise and temperature rise, they're always described as science, but I mean, to me, I thought one of the fundamental tenets of science was that you were able to conduct controlled experiments and that others were able to reproduce your results. Now, none of these predictions on, for the climate have gone through that process. We haven't constructed two Earths side by side and injected, a certain amount of carbon dioxide into one and a certain amount of carbon dioxide into the other. You can't do that. Of course you can't do that. I mean, what we've got really is more akin to economics, where you're relying on, simplified, crude computer models to tell you what's going to happen in the future. And we know, just how askew the economic models have been over the past few years. And it seems to me that the same is probably going to turn out to be true of the climatic models.
Thank you.
I think astronomy is a better analogy. You can't do experiments in astronomy either, but there is a science of astronomy.
Well, you can, if you're referring to sort of, calculating the next eclipse of the moon, I mean, it's a sort of rather much more precise mathematical process. I mean, the thing about the climate, there's just such a multitude of factors involved that it's a chaotic system, and therefore, a prediction becomes impossible.
Thank you, Ross. And Kirk, finally.
Phil asked for an example of where this eco-imperialism or kind of Western kind of like interference and developing role plays itself out. And I spent some time in a wildlife sanctuary close to the dam that James Hartfield mentioned in Gujarat in India. And this was a wildlife sanctuary basically created to placate Western environmentalists who basically were arguing that the creation of this dam on the Narmada River in India, which is the only river that goes from, I was getting this wrong, east to west in India, was going to not just resettle people, but also have a devastating impact on the environment and the Narmada Valley. So basically they created this wildlife sanctuary behind the backs of the people who lived in it, like 40,000 Advasis, tribal people, who basically woke up one morning to discover they're living in like Hyde Park. That there's a wildlife park created around them, no longer could they fish, could they farm, No longer could they repair bridges or roads. No longer could they chop down trees for firewood. Basically, to placate a Western demand for a wildlife sanctuary. So I went there, spent 3 or 4 months there, kind of researching the plight of these people, and it's called the Chul Panashwar Sloth Bear Wildlife Sanctuary. So I spent some time in this wildlife sanctuary looking for this bear. It doesn't exist. And I said to one of the guys in one of the villages, I said, have you seen the bear? He said, yeah, I saw it last week. We took the school to the local zoo to go and see it. I mean, there were no bears there at all, but it was placated basically to offset the kind of criticism of the dam. And I don't leave people on a kind of downer. I think we do need to take this discussion seriously, but I really do think that we need to take quite seriously that we are at the beginning of a pretty serious economic recession, which is going to, see most of our living standards impacted on. And I think internationally it's going to see a great deal of kind of rejigging and reorganising. And I think that in that sense, we really do need to scrutinise and look at the justifications the Western elites, the NGOs, the charities give for our involvement in developing world countries. And I really do think that, some of our involvement in the future is going to be deadly for the people who are living there, and I think dangerous for the people whose name it is carried out in, which is us. And I do think we need to scrutinise very severely all the justifications for involvement in the developing world, because I think they're not benign at all.
Okay. Thank you, Kirk. There's an interesting note to end on, given some of the other sessions we've had discussed at the battle this weekend with the credit crunch and how that's going to intersect with the broader ideas we've been discussing all weekend. So it only remains for me to say there's a coffee break now for half an hour, so please go and restore yourselves before the final sessions. But before you go, please put your hands together to thank the panel for the debate.